Welcome to Brave Inflections. My name is Claudelle von Eck, and I have with me today Ansie Ramalho, and I'm really excited about having her on board in this conversation, a woman with a wealth of knowledge. But Ansie, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. This is the second part of a conversation that I'm having with Ansie. The first part is in a different video. I encourage you to go and watch that video because there's a lot of stuff in there. Ansie was really generous in sharing her knowledge in that one. Ansie, a little bit about yourself.
So Claudelle, I'm a lawyer by training, but the odd thing is that I worked most of my career at an audit firm. So I started my career doing the odd thing, and I started out by being involved in estate planning, tax planning. Eventually, that evolved into tax, and then that eventually developed into an involvement in corporate recoveries. In other words, insolvent estates, a different type of estate. And then from there, I suppose it wasn't such a big jump to corporate governance, because corporate governance is the flip side of corporate failure, right? Or supposed to be the flip side of corporate failure. So unbeknownst to me, my career path actually prepared me for where I ended up, which is in corporate governance as my specialty. And so corporate governance, directors' duties, the Companies Act, that's the sort of thing that I enjoy. I train in it, on it. I write about it, and then I also have a couple of non-executive directorship positions, and yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
And let us not forget that you are now chairing the King Committee.
Yes, then there's that.
Yeah, and then there's that, and that is quite a big deal. And I'm saying she's chairing the King Committee now, but she was also the project lead and putting King 4 together, which is quite something. Now the King report is well renowned worldwide, and I think a lot of countries have started to adopt the King Code as well. So Ansie really comes with she is really a packet of dynamite, a lot of wisdom and knowledge, which is why I had to grab her and bring her into this conversation with me. And thank you so much, Ansie, for agreeing to have the conversation with me. So let me jump straight in and ask this question of you. And that is, when I read the King 4 principles, yeah, so it's 16 plus 1, right? When I read the principles, what seems to me is that a lot of those principles, underlying those principles, are what we would traditionally see as feminine attributes. So in the previous conversation, at some point we touched on the yin-yang balance, the feminine power and the masculine power. So that's the sense that I get. And with that sense, when I look at where we are, where organizations are, it still feels to me like the feminine power or the feminine attributes are still not really being appreciated by organizations. And one can see that in terms of the number of women that are at the top as well. Your thoughts around that?
No, I agree with you, Claudelle. I think that the female form of power is not appreciated for what it can bring, what it can contribute, and in fact, just the opposite. And if you have a look at what went wrong at and let me mention three very prominent corporate governance failures in South Africa. If you look at Steinhoff, if you look at African Bank, and if you look at Tongaat, what those three companies had in common was a very dominant CEO. And if you read what is in the public domain about these three CEOs, and we weren't inside of any of these companies, so if that is anything to go by, then it seems that all three of these CEOs were very dominant. They followed a more autocratic leadership style. There was very little room for dissent. Sometimes some of these CEOs are now said to have been outright bullies. Others were simply intimidating because of their level of knowledge and experience and how adamant they were that they were correct. To the point where one of the reports I read used the term hubris.
Yeah.
So I think a less dominant, a more empathetic, collaborative, inclusive style of leadership is what we now require. Because with this dominant, autocratic sort of leadership, what happens is that you are exposed as a company to a dominant point of view, which does not leave room for dissent or other views or alternatives. And that means that it's easy even with the best of intentions, even if the CEO is an upright, ethical person, no person is infallible. Yeah. Now, what protects that CEO and his company against his errors in judgment? It is other views, it's alternatives, it's diversity, diverse opinions, it's testing opposing views, which is where we need to end up. And that is the value that the female attributes can bring to a conversation. Now, I also want us to be careful to, what I'm saying is not that male leaders are bad and female leaders are good, but female leaders have male or masculine and feminine attributes, and the same with the male leaders. It's just that our paradigm, our notion of leadership has become so masculine. And so now our leaders, male and surprisingly female, are following this paradigm. Female leaders, or many female leaders, think that they have to become like more masculine in their leadership style to have any effect. So it's not about male leaders are bad and female leaders are good. It's just about bringing a diverse approach to the leadership style.
And I fully agree with you. I mean, it's we have to. It's about balance, isn't it? It's about making sure that you have that good balance in terms of the energies, the male and the masculine and feminine energies in the organization. I mean, you touched on a very important point, which has been worrying me for quite a while. I think one is starting to see a little bit of a shift in that in the younger generation coming through. But it seems like a lot of women, because I suppose because they've had to fight to get to where they are in those own leadership positions, tended then to assimilate and behave more in a masculine manner, because that is how you win, right? But to bring about the balance, you kind of need to, I suppose you need the men to understand the value that the feminine energy brings, and see it as amplifying them as opposed to diminishing them. But on the other hand, there is the woman also, because if you have women then becoming more like men, or behaving more like men, or and take on more the masculine attributes, you then still remain with that imbalance. You can't bring the balance about unless both sides understand the value. But do you think, if you're looking at women today, do you think that women are owning the value of that feminine energy, and the value that it brings to the organization?
No, often not. Definitely not. There are definitely feminine attributes that are seen as soft and not as strong as the masculine attributes. Which is completely the opposite. Let's take inclusivity as an example. And the problem that we have with, or the lack of inclusivity that we have, I think it's a leading indicator of us not accomplishing things like transformation.
Yeah.
Because our whole stance and posture is incorrect. Something like transformation, you don't achieve through a numbers game. You achieve it by having the right, I'm going to use your word, Claudelle, the right energy about it, the right attitude about it. If that is what is underpinning what you're doing, that energy of inclusivity, then transformation will follow as a result. But that's not how we do it. We started from the other end. So, but to be inclusive, it means you have to be brave enough to entertain people with different sort of outlooks, approaches, views, stances, sometimes people who vehemently oppose you. Now that is strength. That's not weakness. That's not soft. So we really need to change how we look at strength and weakness, and how we look at our leadership styles in general. And again, we spoke about it in our previous conversation, judging things in absolute. This is good and this is bad. So I think our world, we now need this complementary styles of leadership and the whole continuum in between for us to succeed.
Yeah. Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you on that. And for me, I think the important issue is that in the previous video you talked about self-awareness, and also in that self-awareness, you said what's and all, the words that you use, right? Also remembering that in those what's are biases and prejudices.
Yes.
So you've got to be able to, and that, as you said, takes strength. It takes courage to face yourself, and to realize that I am sitting with biases that may close my ears from hearing those people who come from a different perspective, who see through a different lens. And then realizing that if I can find the strength within myself to listen and to look through their lenses, I may learn something.
Yes,
and that I may shift in the process, and that it's if one can become a lot more fluid, that is how we can get to that point into inclusivity. But each one of us have to realize I'm part of the problem. If I can't open myself up and listen to others, But you're quite right. I quite like the fact that you brought up the issue of transformation is not a numbers game. And I've often said this, that I found myself in spaces where you're a woman and you're a woman of color. And when you say, in some spaces, you find that when you speak into a black hole. It's like your words disappear. And you know what you've just said makes absolute sense, but people are not listening because they are listening to what they're seeing instead of listening to what they're hearing, what comes out of the person's mouth.
Yeah.
Let me shift a little bit, Ansie, and ask you about, I really want your thoughts on, if we look at the last year or so, we're sitting in the middle of a pandemic, and there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't really know where things are going. But in looking back and over the last year, I think, at least for me, the pandemic has really put a spotlight on the ugly underbelly of capitalism. And the question that I have in my head is whether leaders, organizational leaders, political leaders, and so on, whether leaders are seeing that ugly underbelly, and whether that is making them shift the way they're leading organizations. So what I would like your thoughts on that, and maybe also you can touch on what advice you would give to leaders in this context.
That's a very interesting question. And I do think it's one of the areas that we're starting to shift. I think the awareness of that ugly underbelly, as you call it, is raising. And the COVID pandemic has amplified a couple of things, and I think that is one of it. You can also see it in how investors are now approaching, for example, climate change. And it's something that should have happened years, decades ago, but, well, at least we now, yeah. But so investors who want a return on the investment also understand that the way that capitalism has been practiced is not sustainable. We can't carry on with this way of life. Now, what I think is capitalism got tainted by the wrong set of values and beliefs. A system builds up from personal and individual beliefs and values, which then becomes collective beliefs and values, or a culture. And that culture then gets formalized into a system like capitalism. And what has underpinned capitalism was this idea, this value, money, and what money will mean for you. That if you have a lot of money, that defines that you're successful. If you have a lot of money, you'll be happy. If you have a lot of money and stuff, it means that your life now has meaning.
So it created a very materialistic society.
Very. This take, make, waste thing, which is where we now ended up in this unsustainable place. So if that's the thing that builds the system, then one cannot be surprised that the system itself then shows up these cracks and weaknesses and an ugly underbelly, as you're saying. But I do believe that there's a lot of good in the system as well, that we just need to learn to harness better for the benefit of humanity. And we're sort of getting there. We're grappling with all sorts of concepts. For example, if you look at King 4, you will see the way that ethics is defined is by saying we must achieve what is good for the self, the organization in this context, and the other. in other words, the stakeholders of the organization. And this is this whole, if you put that paradigm over the traditional capitalist system, that means that the way you look at success means that success is not limited to how you can selfishly make yourself as the organization and your shareholders wealthy. It also means that you have to expand that and think about how you can create value for you as the organization. There's nothing wrong with that. For your shareholders, nothing wrong in that, but also your other stakeholders, your employees, society, communities, and our natural environment on which we all depend on. So, capitalism, we used to see it as the salvation for all of our problems. Money solves all problems. And that's where Milton Friedman, the Nobel-winning economist, came from when he said in the 70s, and I'm sure all the listeners know about this, where Friedman said that the social obligation of a company is to be profitable. And he's much maligned for it, but he had a very logical premise for saying so, because companies that are profitable pay taxes. Those taxes can be employed for the good of society. Companies that are profitable provide opportunities for employment. Companies that are profitable provide investment opportunities. But what he missed in that was that there's not only this trickle down of benefits, there's also a trickle down of harm.
Yeah.
And with companies becoming so powerful, of course, that's where the harm, and that's why we now have to contend with, in large, with things like climate change and so on. So yes, we definitely, I don't think we need to throw out the whole system, but we definitely need to look at how we employ the system. And is it employed with an exclusive, strange enough, here we're back to inclusive and exclusive, employed an exclusive mindset or an inclusive mindset? Are we increasing inequality, or are we making the world a better place for everyone? And there are a lot of initiatives around this, shared value, the SDGs, ESG, initiatives around climate change, stewardship codes where investors also ask questions about all of these things. So there's a lot of things happening. My concern is just, and that is the concern of many, is, are we doing it fast enough?
Yeah. I was just going to ask you that question, because that is exactly what is at the back of my mind. Are we doing it fast enough? If one were to look at those for whom the penny has dropped, that as in a leadership position, you are responsible, and part of your responsibility is to make sure that no harm flows, or that you minimize the harm that flows as a result of the organization's activities. As opposed to those where the penny hasn't dropped, because it does seem to me that we still have lots of leaders who are very exclusive in their thinking, to use the terminology that we've just been using, but it's very much focused just on the money and just making money and making more and more money and growth and growth and growth and growth. And there's a significant degree of selfishness in that. And I am not my brother's keeper attitude that you often find, that everybody must, it's every dog for himself, you must look after yourself, I'm here to look after myself. So if one looks at those two camps, I mean, is the good camp winning, and is it winning fast enough? That's the question that it boils down to, isn't it?
I'm hopeful, yes, that it is. Well, not so hopeful about the fast enough, but I'm hopeful that the good camp is well, the more open-minded camp is making headway. What is happening, for example, now on climate change? If you told me 5 years ago that there would be such a groundswell around it, I would have been skeptical about it, but here we are.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of, and it comes from, I want to touch on something that you said. It comes from being open again, which brings us back to our other theme, is about being open to different views, to other opinions, to sometimes really outside views that seem improbable. But if you are strong enough to hold your own beliefs with a healthy amount of skepticism, because you understand and you realize that you are not the holder of all knowledge, that part of life is learning continuously, and that is what brings you to this point. And I think that's another female attribute, is not to be so confident in what you think you believe, or what you think the truth is, shall I put it that way?
Yeah. So now I suppose the big lesson there is for leaders to start to realize that it is actually, they're actually being irresponsible towards the world, but also I suppose towards yourself. You know, if you don't look through other lenses, so that you can broaden your scope of thinking and your and understanding that by the mere fact that you are in a leadership position, that you have to look broader and start to think about impact. So it's not just about what it is that you want to see your organization do and the performance of your organization, but certainly the impact on the greater society and the broader society. Because I think what people often miss, Ansie, is that it circles back to you. If society is in a mess, how is your organization going to become to remain sustainable? So it doesn't help you from that perspective. And see, let me ask you this last question, and we're still staying in the theme of leadership. What do you think are, if you look at the current context and where we are and where we're moving to in the future, what do you think the most important factors are that leaders should have on their radar now?
There's only one certainty, I think, and that is that things will become even more uncertain.
Yeah.
Things will change faster and faster and faster. Things will become more volatile, and it is impossible to try and predict. So how will this manifest? What will that look like when it happens? So it can come in the form of a pandemic. It can come in the form of a natural disaster. That is not a game that you're going to win as a leader. That doesn't mean that you can't look at these and try and get your head around what is probable, even if not likely. But the lesson that I take from this is that our organizations must become resilient. And the way that you become resilient is that you are prepared for crises. You must make sure that you've built reserves. You must make sure that the culture in your organization supports agility.
Yeah.
you need to have, you need to diverse your income stream. You need to look at how innovative you are. So all of these things, I think, is worthwhile investing in preparation for this huge amount of uncertainty, which will remain part of our lives. And it comes from various directions, and we just need to be ready for it. So, yes, I would say leaders to be ready by shock-proofing their organizations in this way.
Yeah, and I suppose the significant amount of shift really comes in the mind shift. You know, it's about how we think about our organizations. And I mean, if you talk about agility, it's not just about the agility in terms of how you can utilize your resources and shift quite quickly, but it's how quickly can your people shift in their heads. And, you know, you remind me of a saying that my yoga instructor used a few days ago, and I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember the exact wording, but it boils down to something like, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in battle, which is so true, right? So if you almost have to continuously, and what I'm hearing you saying, continuously make sure that you are in this state of readiness. It's like living in a jungle. You always have to be on the alert. Danger can come from anywhere. And yes, that uncertain world is like a jungle where you don't know what lives in the jungle and where the path is going to take you. Ansie, you have really, really, really been significantly generous in sharing your thoughts and your wisdom. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. For those of you, if you listen to this video and you haven't listened to the other one, please go and have a listen to the other conversation. This is the second one in a two-part conversation. I'm sure you'll find nuggets in the other one as well. And I'm pretty sure that you've picked up one or two things that you can assimilate into your life, into your organizations, where you can have a conversation starter within the leadership of your organization so that you can move in the right direction. Thank you for visiting the website. I encourage you to look at the rest of the website as well. There are lots of interesting nuggets all over the place. And what I tend to focus on is leadership and courage, and in particular, ethical leadership and ethical courage and culture as well. Ansie, once again, thank you very, very much. And to the listeners, thank you for being here.